Much for the introduction. And hey guys, welcome to the talk. So I think this question, right, like of why does God let bad things happen in our lives? It's the question of evil and suffering. I think it's something that we as people have been kind of looking into for centuries and centuries. So it's a very difficult question. Right. And with the time that we have today, we won't be able to look into all aspects of it, and there's no kind of one word answer or like kind of something that will fully satisfy. To a certain degree, there is an element of mystery to it that we need to understand and accept. But we can also kind of see what God has taught us, over history and through revelation, what God has given us as an insight into this topic. So the first part of it, right, we're going to kind of look at it more of from like an objective point of view. I won't really be bringing in a lot of personal examples or experiences. Helena will be doing that later on, but we're going to look at what do we mean when we say evil or suffering, and why does God allow them, and why is it such a problem in the first place. So firstly, when we're talking about suffering, right, we can kind of break them into two categories. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, perfect. So we can break it into two different categories. So there's moral evils. So these would be things like abuse, murder, just horrific things that we hear of people inflicting upon each other. So it's things that are caused by human beings. And yeah, just kind of horrible things that we would be doing to each other. And then there would be natural or physical suffering. So these would be things like death, earthquake, diseases. So these would be things that are caused by nature, right? And we also need to kind of look at what we mean when we talk about God. So God is being itself, and God is an entity. When we're talking about God, we're talking about a being who is all powerful, all knowing, and all good. So that would be kind of, the definition of God that we can all agree with. So often, there's an atheistic claim that such a God, right, who is all knowing, all good, and all powerful, he cannot coexist with suffering in the world, right? So it's a claim that we might have come across. It's something that we could have thought of ourselves, often something that we would have questioned ourselves. So from this kind of claim, okay, we can look into this whole aspect of evil. When we talk about evil, what is it? When we talk about suffering or pain, what is it? Like, how do we know the difference between good and bad? Okay, how do we know what's the difference between just and unjust? As human beings, is it that we kind of look at it subjectively, like it's what I prefer over what you prefer, or do we have an objective kind of standard that we follow, when we talk about this? So when we look at it, right, as humans, we do have a moral law. We have an objective standard that we would know the difference between good and bad. We would know the difference between good, just and unjust. And so this law points us to a moral lawgiver, right? So it points us to someone who is outside, who has put that moral law in us, who has planted that moral law in us. And so Ravi Zacharias, one of the top Christian apologists, he puts it this way. When he was talking to an atheist about it, he says, when you say there's too much evil in this world, you would assume that there is good. When you assume that there's good, you assume that there's such a thing as moral law, on basis of which we differentiate between good and evil. So it's not something that is objective. It's not something, that's subjective. It's something that is objective. But if you assume a moral law, you would posit that there is a moral lawgiver, right? But that's who you're trying to disapprove. That's who the atheist would be trying to disapprove, or say that, this person doesn't exist, or this entity doesn't exist. But when you turn it around, if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good, and then hence there's no evil. So he kind of asks the question back, so what really is your question? So the point that he's trying to make is that pain and suffering, right, the problem of evil is only a problem if we have God in the picture, if we have God in the paradigm, because otherwise things are just the way they are. It's all just natural. It's just the way things are. It wouldn't really be a problem, right? So it points to the fact that there is a God that we kind of cry out to in the face of injustice. Okay, so then we go into this question of why does God allow such evils to happen, and this is not an easy question. It's okay, sorry, I got distracted by the waiting room. So this is not an easy question. Okay, like I said, it's something that as humans we have kind of grappled over for years and years, and so there's no kind of one word answer or like one solution to it, but one kind of good reasoning that we can see as Christians, and one kind of reason that we can come to terms with um, is the idea of free will, right? So when we look at moral evil, so again the idea of people inflicting pain upon one another, or evil that humans carry out, why is that allowed? So one good answer to it would be free will, right? The gift of free will that God has given us. So when God created us and angelic beings, okay, so we can see that angelic being like Satan before he was Lucifer, that they have fallen away as well. So when God created us, he gave us the freedom to either walk away from him, okay, or walk towards him in that freedom. So he gave us that control over our lives to either choose sin or choose evil or choose good, right? And not just for us, but when he created the world as well, he created a world that exists on its own terms. So it's a world that allows for free processes, for things to break apart, for things to come together, for things like earthquakes or things to fall apart so that they can build things together again, for the earth to recycle. So he created a world that exists on its own terms with laws and with the laws like laws of physics and things like that, for things to take place and for things to kind of work around itself. So even the CCC, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, talks about this, that God freely willed to create a world in a state of journeying, right? So towards its ultimate perfection. So it's a world that is constantly evolving and changing. So when God gave us our freedom as well, right? You look at original sin, so Adam and Eve, from them turning away from God, from them misusing their freedom, and from original sin coming into the world, suffering and death entered the world, right? So that fall that mankind had, that was not part of God's perfect will for us. Okay, so I'll be looking into that later on. But that fall that mankind had, it had huge consequences. So what that did was it fractured our relationship with God and also fractured our relation with nature, right? So think of it this way of and so one thing that philosophers and theologians actually kind of claim is that before the fall, right, our souls and our bodies, they were protected in God's grace. But when our souls fell away, after the fall, when our souls fell away, so did our bodies, and that made us more prone to diseases and more prone to sufferings, right? So if you look at it this way, think about a rower, right, in a boat, and that rower refuses to row the boat in the right direction or in the correct way. So when that person is refusing to row the boat in the correct way, he's not only affecting himself, but also the people who are in the boat with him, and he might even damage the boat itself. So when we put ourselves into that story, we can see that our refusal to fulfill God's purpose for us, right? And God's purpose for us is that we know him and that we can enjoy his creation as he built it according to his laws. And when we refuse to do so, we not only damage ourselves, but also the people around us and also our nature. Okay. So when we have the freedom to choose, so we need to understand that we have that freedom to choose to do evil or to do good. And that it'll have, and it did, and it is also having an impact on the world around us. And even when we look at natural disasters, right, often we talk about kind of natural evils, and to a certain degree we can't pinpoint, oh, this is exactly why this happened, but we can also see how our vulnerability is in a way kind of led by our moral evil as well. So for example, if an earthquake happens in the middle of nowhere, right, that's not really going to affect us, but where the problem comes where we're vulnerable to it. So you can see a natural calamity happening in a third world country, the kind of devastation that that has on that country compared to that calamity happening in a first world country, you know. So moral evils like injustice or poverty, these all kind of come into play on how such events, such natural events, have an effect on us. So another important distinction I think we need to make is that when we say often, you know, in the face of suffering, right? For example, if someone loses a child or something just horrible that happens in someone's life, you know, in a way of comfort, we might say, oh, look, it's all God's plan, you know, it's all part of his will. That's, in a way, it's not true, but it's true at the same time. Okay, so God, he's intimately involved in our lives, right? And we can see this in scripture as well, that there's nothing in our lives that happen without God knowing it. Okay, so like we said, God is all knowing, and he is involved in our lives in every aspect of it, you know. So even in scripture it says, you know, not a sparrow falls from the sky that God does not know of. But like I said earlier, God is not in full control of our choices. You know, he has given us that free will to make our own choices, to make our own decisions, and either that is to obey him or to disobey him. Okay, so we need to differentiate between God's perfect will and God's permissive will. So God's perfect will would be what he directly wills in our lives, and that is for our holiness, that's for our ultimate fulfillment. You know, often we would think that as human beings, our fulfillment would come from our happiness, like our ultimate goal would be for us to be happy, but that's not really true. Our ultimate fulfillment is in actually knowing God, you know, because we're created for him and in him, right? So his perfect will would be that we grow in that holiness and we grow in knowing him. And then his permissive will would be, you know, what he allows. So that would be the death and suffering and the evil that we see in the world. God doesn't directly will that, you know, he doesn't will for that child to die, or he doesn't will for something horrible to happen to someone, but he allows it, you know, as part of like I said, as part of our free will, you know, as part of our nature, and also because of our fallen nature, you know, that God has allowed that to happen. And the reason why he did that is because he's not a tyrant and we're not robots. Okay, so when we look at when we talk about this aspect of free will, you know, God cannot force us to freely choose. Those are two contradictory things. So it's like expecting uh, a circular square. You know, those two things are contradictory, they don't logically make sense. And so God can't force us to freely choose. You know, we can't have free will and God making choices for us at the same time, right? So it's important that we understand that, you know, our freedom in making those choices, and in being contributors, or, you know, co-workers in God's plan, has a huge impact on the world around us. Okay, so again, coming to this question of, you know, then why doesn't he take evil away? Why is there evil in the world? Again, there's no kind of simple clear-cut answer to it. You know, there's and from this kind of time that we have, there's only so much that we can understand. And I'll lead you guys to resources later on, but, you know, there isn't like a straight up answer that, you know, from this you're going to fully understand it, because we can't, you know, with our finite knowledge, there's only so much that we can understand about this from what God has revealed to us. But one thing, you know, one reason would be that God, sorry, my screen. Okay. One good reason would be that, you know, God deems that our freedom, right, out of his love, that the freedom that we have is of a greater good than taking it away for our kind of temporary security or safety, you know. And the other day, actually, my nephew and I, we were in the garden and we were kind of looking at the birds that are flying around, and there was this little sparrow that came right next to us, and my nephew was just looking at it, but I was so kind of tempted to hold the bird and to, like, you know, just to take it into my hands. And I was thinking of this image that we often have of, like, you know, the bird that is captured in a cage versus the bird that's let go. You know, when often we would expect God, right, if we are to be that bird, often we would expect God to kind of hold us, you know, and like clench onto us when when we come across suffering or when we come across evil. But think about that bird's life then, that's it. That's all that there is to that bird's life, that it's stuck. There's nothing that that bird can do, and it's just being controlled and it's just being clenched. But God doesn't want that for us. If when we love someone or when we love something, we wouldn't do that to that person or that thing. So God, out of his infinite love, out of his unconditional love, he can't possibly just clench onto us. And so that bird is let go, and so we are let go. And we might be exposed to things that could harm us, things that could endanger us, but yet that doesn't but there's a greater good that comes out of it, that we still have that opportunity to live our lives to the fullest, live our lives to see other things, to grow in that potential. So think about that bird, for example. That bird can go off and just travel off, and yeah, it might come across storms and winds, but that bird also has the opportunity to have offspring, to produce great things. And so out of love, God deems that the freedom that we have is of that greater good. And the other reason why that we could possibly point to that God doesn't take evil away is that he knows that even out of the worst suffering, right, God can bring about a greater good. And even from our human perspective, we sometimes inflict suffering upon ourselves because we know that there's a greater good that comes out of it. An example would be going to a dentist. No one likes going to a dentist, but we know that it's for our better health. And similarly, often when we come across suffering that just might look pointless, even during this pandemic, we might think like, what's the point of this? But it's like the image that you see there on the screen of us seeing that suffering or that kind of aspect as kind of scratches and dots, but God sees the bigger picture. God sees the Abraham Lincoln picture out of it. So it's with our finite knowledge, it's very difficult for us to understand exactly why something is happening in our lives, and even when we're offering as a word of comfort to someone to say, oh, this is exactly why, God's going to do this in your life now, so don't worry about it. We can't say that. It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint at things, to say this is exactly why a certain suffering is happening in our lives, because we don't see the full picture, but God does, and so we need to understand that God, who is not kind of limited by that time or space, that he can see the fuller picture. And then, there isn't, it's not impossible for God to bring out a greater good. So just to kind of summarize and bring things, I suppose, to kind of bring things together, this is a very difficult question, and I can't fully answer this. I don't think, in our lifetime that we would fully be able to understand why there's all this evil and suffering in the world. But we can, from what God has revealed to us and from our history, we can kind of we can see good reasoning for it, and we can know that in God's goodness that he can bring about a greater good out of it. And so even so one thing that we could say is, why doesn't God take it away? It would be contrary to his infinite wisdom and goodness that he has given us the free will. So to take that away, that would be contrary of God's nature. And also that God, in his divine knowledge, in his providence, he knows that he can bring out a greater good from it. And there's this quote actually that Saint Augustine says, again, to bring that point back, that God judged it better to bring good out of evil than for no suffering to exist, than for no evil to exist. And we can see that even amidst the suffering, right, that we see in the world, there are moral goods that come out of it. Like during this pandemic, for example, moral goods like heroism during the time of danger, or compassion during the time of suffering. These kind of moral goods come out of suffering, out of pain. That's the kind of thing that we see in the world, that even amidst the worst things, there's so much good that comes out of it. And God, again, in no way directly or indirectly causes that moral evil. Okay, he permits it because he respects our freedom as creatures, again tying it into free will, and he also knows how to derive good out of it. And the thing about Christianity, right, amidst all this, is that we can see a God who actually suffered with us. When we look at possibly the worst thing that happened in history of mankind is that God himself came down to earth. He became vulnerable, and we killed God, right? We killed God, but he actually brought out the greatest thing that happened in history, then, that God saved us. So we actually have a God who suffers with us. He's not a God who is distant in our suffering, but he's there with us. So yeah, so just for us to kind of wind up, Helena will be talking about how we can face suffering as Christians, and how we can offer advice to others, or be with them during the time of suffering. But just to wind this part of it up, it's important that we know that our free will comes into play a lot in the face of moral evils, right? And more importantly, that we know that no matter what suffering or evil we face, God can definitely bring something great out of it, and it's difficult for us to understand because of our finite knowledge. But God, who sees the bigger picture, God who sees the full picture, will know. He knows, what is good for us, and we might not realize it now, but in eternal life, like, our life is not bound just on earth. In eternal life, when we come face to face with God, these things will be fully revealed to us. Yeah, so on that note, I'm just going to pass it on to Helena.
Right. So like Anju said, there is no like one word answer on how to deal with how to understand suffering, and how to understand why God allows suffering. But there is something that we can do. We can learn how to deal with suffering. So I was kind of like looking at a saint to talk about today. So I was running through so many saints, and I noticed that there was a few things that they all did in common when it came to suffering. Now, they all suffered. So, we can learn from them and see what's necessary for us to bear our sufferings. One thing that they all did is pray. And if Anju, if you could move to the next slide. Yeah, prayer. We all do this in times of desperation, when we're like when we feel like like we have no control on what's going on around us, and that's the right thing to do. Prayer is communication with God. We tell him our worries, we tell him our distresses, we try to listen to God, and that's what Jesus himself showed us to do. Jesus, being completely human and completely God, he prayed to God in his time of agony. If we look at the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup away from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He expressed his worries and his distresses and his discomfort, and he offered them up to God and to his Father. And that's exactly the perfect example that we have when it comes to dealing with suffering. So prayer, this can be through daily mass, adoration, reading the Word of God, personal prayer that you can do every day. And that communication allows us to trust in God, because if you think about it, any relationship that we have needs communication to grow in love and in trust. So we have to do the exact same with our relationship with God, because if we lack in communication, we won't be able to trust God, we won't be able to love God, and that will make our sufferings harder for us to bear. So prayer is very important. Another thing that's easily, I feel like, the most difficult thing to do when it comes to suffering is to accept them with serenity and patience. And to do this, you have to have that prayer in your life, that relationship with God, that communication with God. And from this, you'll be able to be patient with your sufferings. Otherwise, your sufferings, you're so irritated by your sufferings that you don't see, you, first of all, like Anju said, you can never probably fully see the bigger picture. But God has a bigger picture in plan, like in his mind, when it comes to what happens in our lives. So when we suffer, there might be lessons in there that we can learn, and merit that we could have gained. But if we're constantly irritated and frustrated and refusing to kind of accept the suffering, we won't learn any of the lessons, we won't gain any of the merit. So we have to constantly, in our times of prayer, we have to pray for patience as well, to be patient with our suffering, and to allow God's will to happen in our lives. And that is said to be the secret of happiness, this patience, and the trust that we give God will truly allow us to be joyful. And then, for me, I would say that, like, crying is the way I deal with suffering. But when I was looking at all these saints, they all did something similar, which was open up to someone about their suffering, whether it be through crying or ranting or just sitting down and talking with them. Talking to people about your issues, about the questions that you may have in your life, can give you the spiritual guidance that you need. So this can be through spiritual directors, your elders, your when you go to confession and you open up to your confessor, and sometimes even our friends, if they're like, they understand the spiritual level that we're on, and we open up to them, they might be able to give us the right kind of guidance that we need. So if we were to look at a saint, Anju, if you could go on to the next slide, there we can see the saint. Yeah, we can see Saint Gemma Galgani. Now, most of you probably haven't heard of her. So she is a patron saint of students, pharmacists, against temptations, against death of parents, against tuberculosis. So from this itself, you can probably see all the suffering that she went through. She was fairly young, so she was born in 1878 into like a well-educated family, and her mother was diagnosed with tuberculosis when she was quite young, and that affected her quite a bit, because she was closest to her mother. And then her mother died of tuberculosis. She became very ill with meningitis, had to drop out of school because of that. She wasn't allowed into the convent because of that, and that pained her greatly. Her family lost all their belongings, all their like their land and property and stuff, before her father died, and then she got tuberculosis, and that's how she died. So you can see, and with this, she was going through temptations. She was being isolated because of her faith. There was a lot of things going on in her life that we would consider suffering. So she says herself, when she talked to her confessor, she said, "I can say with truth that since Mama's death, I have not passed a day without suffering some little thing for Jesus." So how did she deal with her sufferings? So when we look at it, when we look into our lives, we can see that she was also a great person of prayer. From a very young age, she constantly prayed. She constantly developed her relationship with God. She was in constant communication with God. And so whenever she came into times of suffering, she would pray. She would pray for the strength to continue, to be able to continue suffering. So when she became very ill with meningitis, so that was when she was in her teens. Throughout this illness, her one like regret was the trouble she was causing for the people that was taking care of her, and she was also being tempted by the devil at this time. It said that she came into like direct contact with the devil, and she was directly being tempted by the devil. So at that time, she prayed to God through then Venerable Passionist and now Saint Gabriel Pogenti. And she truly believes that it's through this intercession, through the prayers that she did at that time, that she was like miraculously cured. And again, patience in her sufferings, and surrendering her sufferings. She completely surrendered all her sufferings because she was able to love and trust God through that relationship that she had built. She, like Jesus, said, "Your will be done," and that gave her that patience to deal with all of this suffering. When she was suffering with meningitis, she lost her hearing, she lost her hair, she was in terrible pain. But through her love for God, her patience allowed her to bear all that sufferings, and people were so awed by the fact that she was going through this much suffering without giving up hope, that they would travel to see her. And like I said, opening up to someone. She had a spiritual director who was her regular confessor, who also wrote her biography, Father Germanus Ruopolo, who constantly advised her on, how to communicate with God and how to understand his messages for her. So through her life, we can see that, prayer, being able to accept our sufferings through serenity, with serenity and patience, and having someone to kind of talk to about our problems, and spiritually guide us through our problems. These things can really help us to deal with our sufferings. So we've gone through how to deal with our sufferings. There's also other things that you can do, but how do we talk to someone who is suffering? So if you look at the Bible, the book of Job says a lot about suffering. Job, if you don't know, he was a man who was doing well in his life. He was also a righteous man, a man of God. Yet, all of a sudden, all of this suffering hit him, and he lost everything. And he was trying to understand the reasoning behind all of this suffering. So that book teaches us a lot about how we can communicate with someone who is suffering. So there were 4 steps, or 4 things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking to someone who's going through a lot of suffering. Number 1, just making sure that they actually want to talk about it. Don't force them to talk. Don't rush them into things. Trust that they'll be able to do it on their own time, and learn to be present in the meantime. Romans chapter 12:15 says, we ought to mourn with those who mourn. When Job experienced his traumatic loss, his friends visited him and stayed with him for 7 days, and they just stayed with him in silence. They didn't say much, and they were just, you know, surrounding him with love and care. And sometimes that can be comforting, but also, you know when to leave, know when your presence is becoming a burden. um yeah, don't overstay. um and then don't say unkind things. Now, I know, you know, if you see someone who's suffering, you obviously won't go and say really harsh things to them, but you could say things with a good intention that just aren't, things that aren't appropriate, um, and they end up being unkind. So Job's friends were convinced that they knew the reason for his suffering, that he had done something wrong to deserve his punishment. Um, our misguided theology can bring a lot of hurt to others. Sometimes even quoting scripture and saying, you know, God will use this for your good, might be inappropriate. And at the moments when we don't know what to say, pray for the wisdom so that you may know the right thing to say at the right time. And when it comes time to speak, speak the truth. Um, there will come a time when your friend wants to talk about their suffering. They will want to share their thoughts, feelings, or any of the questions that have like persisted them, that have persisted since the trial began. When that time comes, speak the gospel truth. Um, Job knew. He said, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth." Um, he this like the love that God has for us, showing that love to our friends, or to whoever is suffering, um, that will encourage them, that will motivate them to like keep on going, keep being strong. um, Remind them that God has not abandoned them, because God himself, like Andrew said, he came down in human form. He suffered in a human nature. He went through all that pain and suffering when he didn't have to, um, being, you know, completely God. He didn't need to, but then his love for us and his will for us to be saved, um, allowed him to do that. So he has been through this suffering, and remind your friend that, you know, that God will not abandon you in your time, in your times of suffering. And number 4, don't rush the process. Um, Said this in, I think, in like number one, but it's just really important, because I'm guilty of doing this. You know, you might think that after a certain time has passed, that that person should have moved on from their problem, from, or the grief or sorrow that they have, but that's not always possible. When, you know, you might think that, okay, I kind of went through a similar problem, it took me X amount of time to get over it, it should take them X amount of time to get over it. Job's wife said the same thing. She said, curse God and die. She just wanted him to get over it. But some trials linger with people for much of their lives, and as friends, as people who are there for them, we need to stick with them for the long haul. Speaking like personally, like I if you don't know much about me, I grew up in a Catholic family. I was I was born in India. I'm 20 years old now. So my parents were devout Catholics, and my life was surrounded by them. They were like the only ones I had, and I kind of did anything I could do to please them. So when it came to, because they were devout Catholics, when it came to, you know, religious activities, I always, you know, followed whatever would please them. So when it came to church activities, I was first in line to join, to sign up. But this wasn't because of my understanding for God. Like I said, it was to please my parents, but also to kind of like keep me active or entertained during Mass, which I didn't understand at the time as well. So I was quite young. I was about 6 or 7 during this time. So it was a couple of years after that that I kind of started to realize that things weren't so perfect at home. The people who I knew to be, you know, my everything, they had flaws in them, as you would expect. And I was starting to recognize this, and there were conflicts at home, you know, and a real threat of a broken household. The problems at home would eventually lead me to like blame myself for what was happening, and I was convinced that it was my sins that caused all of this to happen. While this was happening, like this thing was going on, I discovered that I was developing a health condition that would affect like many aspects of my life. Things that would involve a lot of suffering in the future as well. So any moments of joy that I had in my life would be overwhelmed by the thoughts that I could be completely without joy, without happiness, and I dreaded this. And it was at this point that my faith was almost non-existent. I started wondering how such a God could exist. The questions that we were going through today as well. How could a God exist when I lead such a painful life? How can he love me personally when I'm going through all this suffering? I didn't open up to about my problems to anyone. I really just kept them to myself, because in my head I was like, no one can do anything about this. So what's the point? And this was the time that I was beginning to think that, you know, my life was pointless, and it could only bring pain to others. So I remember I used to cry to bed often, like almost all nights. And it was with the little faith that I had that I would pray that my life would come to an end, because I had simply just had enough. So one day I was going to church for some reason, and I noticed that adoration was happening. Mind you, I am not a person to sit silently and pray. Never mind during adoration. I can't even sit still, like, to date. But that day something just tugged at my heart. I just knew I had to like go in and like sit with the Blessed Sacrament. And I went and I sat, and I was able to just open up my heart and pour out everything on my mind. And just for the first time in my life, I just felt understood. I felt as if there was someone who knew all of my suffering and was there to help me, and he was willing to listen, and he had been listening all this time. I just couldn't comprehend. I can never put into words what I felt that day. But from that moment on, there was this bud of hope growing within me. I just knew that the Lord existed and that he saw me. My life became of worth, you know. Up until then, the reason behind my smile was just to hide my suffering. But that instantly changed, and now I smile because I could see the beauty of God's creations all around me. Everywhere I went, every person I met, I felt like I could just see Jesus and just something good about them. My attitude became so much more joyful. And then I remember it was that year that I had my first honest confession as well. But my life didn't make a U-turn instantly. I still had the same sufferings. I was constantly falling into sin. But what changed was I was able to recognize God's presence in my life, and I was able to trust that He had given me the means to carry my burdens, whether it be through prayer or ministry, or the people that He put around in my life, that could spiritually guide me. And every time I drew back from God, describing that experience that I had, you'd think that I wouldn't have drawn away from Him, but I still managed to keep a distance from Him. But he somehow pulls me back each time, like I said, whether it be through prayer, ministry, or through my friends. And this time I'm even closer to Him than I was before. And now I know that when I deal with suffering, I need to immediately turn to God, communicate my emotions to Him, and trust Him with my life. This trust wasn't easy to build. Like, I'm not saying it's something easy to build, and I still have difficulty, trusting God. I doubt God sometimes. But what I have realized is that every time that I've trusted God with my life, everything I've offered up into His hands has worked for my good and for the good of those around me. So to grow in trust and in love for God, I pray daily. Now without prayer, I feel like there's this hole in my heart, and I'm sick in some sort of way. And I've only been able to carry this out in the last year. I try to go to Mass as many times as possible, at least 3 times, 4 times a week. And I try to be more self-aware, and continuously offer up my struggles in everything that I do. So even if it be the smallest struggle, like working out, I'll just be saying an Our Father throughout my workout, and offering it up to the Lord. Reading scripture and adoration has led me to know God better and trust in His plans for me. And I believe that God will guide me closer to Him. So if I were to say one thing to you, it is that if you are as hopeless as I was in your sufferings, present them to the Lord, offer them up as a sacrifice, as penance. As 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 10 says, and the God of all grace, who called you to His eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. I think that's just beautiful. If you believe this, you will know that God is good, and your sufferings will become easier to bear. So that is my sort of testimony, my experience with sufferings. I think we'll break out into rooms. We have 2 questions for you guys. Andrew, if you want to show them the questions. So yeah, have you ever had an experience of suffering, and what effect did it have on your relationship with God? And the second question being, has anything you heard or discussed today taught you something about how to deal with times of trial in the future?
So requesting you all to unmute your mics, and we're going to recite this prayer together. In every need,
Let me come to Thee, humble trust, saying, Jesus, help me.
All my doubts,
Complexities,
temptations,
temptations, Jesus, help me.
hours
Hours of loneliness, weariness, and trial,
Jesus,
help me.
the failure of my plans, disappointments,
Troubles,
help me.
Jesus, help me. My heart is cast down by failure, thinking no good comes from my efforts.
My
Jesus,
effort,
help
Jesus,
me.
help me.
When others fail me,
Others
and Thy
fail me,
grace
and
alone
thy
can
grace
assist
alone
me.
can assist me.
Jesus,
Jesus, help me. When I throw myself
on
thy
thy
tender
tender
love,
love,
Love
our
as
Father
Father
and
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 Savior,
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 Jesus,
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 help
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 me.
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 When I
I
feel
feel
impatient,
impatient,
Impatient, and my
my
cross
cross
irritates
irritates
me.
me.
Jesus, help
Jesus,
me.
help
Help
me.
me.
Sickness and
Sickness
Sickness
and
loneliness
and
overcome
loneliness
me.
overcome me.
overcome me.
Jesus, help
Jesus,
me.
help me.
Always in
Always
weakness,
in
falls
weakness,
and
Falls and shortcomings of every
but
weakness,
may help me.
and never
and
forsake
never
me.
forsake me.